In our final segment, I'd like to begin by looking at the relationship of Venerable Bruno with Mary. So we'll see something very deep in his life, and obviously extending an invitation to all of us. And the text we're going to look at, you'll have in the handout, but you don't really need to look at it because we're going to look at it piece by piece. It'll all be posted on the screen here. Venerable Bruno died on August 5th, 1830, and the text that we're going to look at was composed the following day. So people were still filing into the church to view the body. And the way things worked at the time, there was a funeral mass, but the real celebration and prayer for the person was 30 days after the death. And so the oblates were preparing for this. In fact, the bishop and many priests came, and a lot of people. Father Antonio Ferrero, who was one of the early oblates and was Venerable Bruno's confessor actually in the final weeks of his life, very close to him, is the one who writes this description of Venerable Bruno and writes it, sends it to this also another priest whose cause of canonization is also underway, Father Giovanni Battista Rubino. Quite a striking thing, two future causes of canonization. And he was a good speaker. They asked him to come and give the sermon at the 30-day Mass for Venerable Bruno. And he needed information in order to put it together. So Father Ferrero sat down and wrote out a lengthy description of Venerable Bruno's life and sent it to him, which is a precious document for us because it's a first-hand witness to his life. And in the course of the pages, dedicates a paragraph to Venerable Bruno's relationship with Mary, and that's the paragraph that we'll be looking at. And so Father Ferrero begins by saying he loved the Virgin Mary deeply. Now that's how I've translated it, and I'll give you the Italian. Era innamorato di Maria Vergine. Now, this word, innamorato, is the word that an Italian young man and young woman today use when you say a young man falls in love with a woman or a young woman with a man, that he is innamorato of her and she innamorata of him. So the most literal translation of what Father Ferrero writes would be that he was in love. He was in love with the Virgin Mary, if you translated it literally. It's one thing you'll see in Venerable Bruno, the one place where he will use tender, warm, feminine kind of language is in relationship to Mary. I guess you could say he's very Italian in this. There's no bounds to this as he relates to Mary. Mary had a very deep place in his life. His mother died in childbirth when he was 4 years old. And he said to the priests in the latter years of his life a couple times this sentence, "I have hardly known any other mother than Mary and have never received anything but caresses from so good a mother." But we shouldn't go too quickly by the first half of this. This is a young boy who at 4 loses the feminine, loses the maternal, and it was never replaced in his life. And there's an aching desire and need that's born in this young boy's heart. And his father, who was a very devout Catholic, in circumstances, the details of which we don't know, although in one of the churches in his home city, there is a painting that is said to be the place where this took place, a painting of Mary. Takes him before an image of Mary and pointing to her says, "She will be your mother from now on." Mary, his relationship to Mary is as deep as a 4-year-old boy's aching need for a mother. It's just rooted and built very deeply into his life. He put up pictures of her everywhere. I like this. You ever see refrigerators like that? I love them. As my own mother got so she was having grandchildren and great-grandchildren, got so the whole refrigerator was covered, you couldn't get any more on there. There's another one. Yeah, on offices, on desks, walls, and homes. We put the pictures of those whom we love and of whom we want to be reminded. And he does this. He just doesn't want Mary ever to be too far from his consciousness. And so if you were to have seen the apartment where he lived, invariably before long looking around, you would have noticed paintings of Mary or maybe a statue of Mary. Do you have any images of Mary where you live? Do you see her image in paintings or statues? And if you do, then you're happy to have them there, and you know the difference they make. If you don't, I'd invite you to consider putting up some images, paintings or statues or whatever of Mary about you. And something warm, even visually, because we're not just a soul, we're bodies too, we have eyes. Let your eyes see the image of Mary, and more than once, as you go about your activities in the course of the day. And Mary will just kind of be finding her way into your heart. You know? There are three images of Mary that are special to me. One is the icon of Our Lady of Tenderness, another is Our Lady of Guadalupe, and the third is the image we showed as we began, Our Lady of Consolation. Find the images of Mary that you love. Put them up where you'll see them. Use it as wallpaper on your computer or phone. On my phone, actually, I have the image of Our Lady of Tenderness. That's my wallpaper, so I'm seeing it constantly all day long. Just some images of people who have done this. Do you have images like this around in your home where you live? It's an invitation. It'll make a difference. He put up pictures of her everywhere. He had a precious collection of books that speak of her and read them for a few hours every week. Probably there would have been things like St. Alphonsus, the Glories of Mary, and there was an imitation of Mary. We have lists of the books that he had, and there are a number of Marian titles in them. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean that someone has a collection of books about a given topic and spends a few hours every week reading about it? If you go into a person's home, and if there is a bookshelf in the home, and you look at it, you will figure out pretty quickly what this person's interests are. It might be history or gardening or golf or politics, whatever it might be. Do you have any books that speak about Mary? Do you ever listen to a podcast about Mary? Have you ever listened to a conference on Mary on YouTube? There is, I would almost want to say more than ever, an abundance of excellent material on Mary. You won't have to look very hard to find wonderful writing on her, very accessible, very easily readable, and very rich. In my own community right now, a bit at a time, we're working through a book which looks at Mary in the Bible. And we read, when we meet, we each read a couple of chapters and talk about them together. It's a lovely exercise. I warmly invite you, if you have not done this, to consider spending some time with Mary every week. Choose the book, choose the podcast, choose the thing on YouTube, whatever it is. Choose it and spend a little time at least in a sustainable way, as we've been saying, with Mary every week. And if you do, what will happen is the same thing that happens, let's say when a young man and young woman get to know each other, or friends deepen in their friendship, or brothers or sisters. They spend time together. They learn more about the other. And as each discovers more about the other, the relationship grows closer. And this is what Venerable Bruno wants to have happen in his relationship with Mary. That as each week and the months and years are going by, that it's getting deeper because he's getting to know her more and more. Through this consistent learning about Mary, spending time and growing in knowledge of her, in church theology, in scripture, in the liturgy, in art, in the many ways that Mary is present to us. And you can just see this relationship being nourished and growing week by week, year by year in his life. He celebrated her novenas, another beautiful thing. And that is, he minds the liturgy as a way to get close to Mary. Mary is repeatedly present in the liturgical cycle. In the Mass, in the Liturgy of the Hours, every day Mary is there. And repeatedly in the liturgical cycle of the Mass. Now, what this means is that, let's say the Feast of the Assumption is 10 days away. So it's August 5th, we'll say. For most of us, the liturgical feast arrives on a certain day. We are grateful for it. We may celebrate, be present at Mass or pray in various ways, but the celebration begins, in this case, on August 15th, the Assumption, or December 8th, the Immaculate Conception. For Venerable Bruno, the feast began 9 days earlier. That's what we mean by a novena. He's looking ahead, aware of it, and spending some time in prayer, again, in a sustainable way, reflecting on it, praying to Mary, preparing, so that when the feast comes, he's going to live it in a whole richer and deeper way. And if the liturgy is the summit of our prayer, which it is, the more we mind the liturgy, the more we're finding solid, rich material is too weak a word, understanding, a relationship with Mary, grace, in order to grow in our relationship with Mary. Liturgically nourished relationship. He spoke very frequently about her. Now, this is how I've translated it here, very frequently about her. The Italian original is frequentissimamente. So the word for frequently in Italian, well, let's start with the adjective. The word for frequent is frequente. If you want to make it an adverb, it's frequentemente, which means frequently. If you want to say about as frequently as you can possibly say it in the superlative, what you say is frequentissimamente. In other words, you wouldn't be around him very long before you'd start hearing about Mary. And this would not be forced. It'd be very natural. Just because, as the scripture says, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. What we speak of often, we do so because we love it. I remember, I'm going to choose a place. Let's say this was California. I worked together with a man for maybe 3 or 4 years at one point. And very quickly, I realized there would be a pattern in all of our conversations. It didn't matter where the conversation started. Before very long, we were going to be speaking about California because it was just so dear to his heart. What do we talk about? Do we ever talk about Mary? When was the last time you ever spoke about Mary? And he speaks frequently of her, and there'll be nothing forced or pious in the negative sense of the word, or devotional in the negative sense. It'll be very sincere. It'll touch hearts because he loves her so much. She's so deeply a part of his life that frequently he'll speak about her. If you grow closer to Mary, you're going to find that this will start to happen in your life too. And it will make a difference for you and for other people. The world needs a mother. The world needs the maternal sensitivity and tenderness. There's far too little of it in the world now. And here is an endless source of this, if we just open our hearts to receive it. He said, it is necessary to lead people to a great confidence in her. Not just a confidence, but a great confidence in her. 3 times in my life, I have been in situations which at the time seemed desperate to me. It seemed to me like there was no way out, that harm was going to happen, there was nothing I could do. I'm grateful to my parents because Mary was very much a part of our home growing up. We prayed the family rosary. Our parish was Most Holy Rosary Parish. And by an instinct that is deeply built into our Catholic Church, at such times I find myself turning to Mary. And the situation is resolved. And this is the, not just devotion, but great confidence in Mary, to which we are invited, which Venerable Bruno lives. You remember the classic prayer attributed to St. Bernard? If you know it, say it with me as we do this now, as you view this. Remember, O most gracious Virgin Mary, that never, without exception, that never was it known that anyone who fled to thy protection, implored thy help, was thought thy intercession was left unaided. And that's the firm confidence of the church. Inspired by this confidence, we fly into thee, the rest of the prayer. The Memorare, beautiful prayer to know, beautiful prayer to pray in times of need. And so he wanted his own presence to be a presence that would lead people not just to love Mary, certainly that, above all that, but to a great confidence in her and to knowing that we can turn to her in situations of struggle and trial and confusion. He wanted whenever his oblate priests would give a talk, would preach a retreat or of any kind, he wanted them to give a talk on Mary. So in a way, I'm doing exactly what he asked us to do now, but I do it very happily and willingly. He spoke of her, and this was three titles that were personally important to him in relationship to Mary. He spoke of her as his mother, as the one who nurtured him, and as his paradise. He spoke of her as his mother. We've already said a bit about this. He lost his mother at 4, hardly known any other mother than the Virgin Mary. This is my own conviction, but I believe that it doesn't matter how old we are. We never outgrow the need for a mother. We always need a mother. And God in the sensitivity of his divine providence gave us one that would never leave us. That's why Therese, for example, so loved the Virgin Mary. Her other mothers died or left, but this mother never left her. And this is how the Council speaks of her, as our mother in the order of grace. So anything that has to do with the living of your vocation, choosing and living of your vocation, your daily life of prayer, your involvement in the church, the sacraments, trying to live the Word of God as you relate to others, you have a mother in all of that. She is our mother in the order of grace. And this is how I image the difference it makes when we have Mary in our spiritual lives. Here are 2 children who come home from school. In one home, the mother is present. In one home, the mother is not. And I know this can touch deep places, so I'll speak with great sensitivity, but you'll see the point. In both cases, the child plays, eats, studies, does, but it's very different in the one case and the other. When the mother is there, there's a safety, a surety, a center, a solidity, a warmth, a tenderness. And that's the difference that Mary can make in our spiritual lives. Bring her into your spiritual life. You will love what happens. Who of us does not need that maternal, warm, tender, loving mother's presence in our spiritual lives? Do you ever pray to Mary? Pray to her. It's probably the best way to get to know her. We've seen a number of ways that will help us to grow, but that's the deepest of them all. This is in the last weeks of his life. This brother Pietro Gardetti, who was a very, I'd say sort of simple in terms of education, wonderful, wonderful man. But at this point was in his early 20s and was assigned to assist Venerable Bruno in the last weeks of his life, and so was constantly with him. And in his 70s, when they were gathering material for the biography and the cause, they asked this brother Pietro to write out his remembrances of Venerable Bruno, which he did, and we have them. There are misspellings and grammatical errors. He was a tailor's apprentice. That was all the education that he had. But he always lived with a great esteem for Venerable Bruno. Well, one of the things he recounts is one day they were in the interior garden of the cloistered area of the community, and Venerable Bruno, who was too weak to do otherwise, was seated on a chair, and the brother was kneeling beside him, and they were praying the rosary. And at a certain point, Venerable Bruno just interrupted the prayer, turned to the brother and said, who was that lady who was just here with us? And the brother, in all simplicity, said, well, Father, we're in a cloistered area, there isn't any lady here. And then Venerable Bruno just went back to the prayer. And said on several occasions in those last weeks to Father Ferrero that there was a beautiful lady who was always with him, holding a lovely child in her arms. It seems that as Mary was the tenderness at the beginning of his life, at the loss of his mother, she was also the tenderness at the end that eased the final passage. one layman who knew his life was not easy. We haven't had time to go into it, but he had many physical problems, severe ones. He never let them stop him. But life physically was not easy. Of course, we've seen the persecutions the church went through. He paid the price personally for his fidelity to the Holy Father when he was in prison. The bishop was ordered to remove his faculties. All of his ministerial works collapsed. He was in his late 50s at this point. He was exiled by order of the French police. And that only ended with the fall of Napoleon. His life was not easy. One layman describes it as, after his death, one good friend of his long and painful career, he describes it. She was the warmth. She was the tenderness that eased the burden. And that after Jesus allowed him to go forward, we need that. You need that. We all need that in the spiritual life. And he spoke of her as the one who nurtured him. I've translated the Italian word nodrice there. That refers to one who nurses a child in the first year or two. So again, it's this very warm, tender kind of language. And Mary is this for him. She is that warm presence that makes sure that the infant has all that it needs. And he spoke of her as his paradise, the one in whose presence the sorrows of life diminished, and in whose love he found peace and joy. Venerable Bruno invites us to live with Mary. And I'll just be the echo of his invitation as we share these reflections. And then a final consideration in the time that remains to us. And I'm going to take this from St. John Paul II, but you'll see this is exactly what Venerable Bruno is calling us to. In 1994, this book was published. We're used these days to popes publishing books, but it was new then. I remember it was just revolutionary. The Pope wrote a book, and couldn't wait to get a hold of it. And actually this book came about because he had agreed to do a television interview with an Italian journalist. The journalist had prepared the questions, sent them to the Holy Father, who was then unable to do the interview. The journalist thought, well, that's that. And had no idea that over the next 2 years, the Holy Father wrote out his answers to those questions, and that's this book, Crossing the Threshold of Hope. It's a lovely book. And one of the chapters is entitled, Do Not Be Afraid. And as you know, this is almost the signature phrase of John Paul II, so often quoted, that he quoted over the years. And the journalist asks him a question. Now I'm going to paraphrase the question that the Pope actually answers, and it's a good journalist question. Essentially what he says is, Your Holiness, you've been saying to the world for years now, do not be afraid. You look at what's going on in this world. Wars, earthquakes, tsunamis, disease, revolutions, nations torn apart, families torn apart, marriages torn apart, a culture in pain, a world in suffering. How can you say to the people of this world, do not be afraid? It's a very good question and a very important question, and I would say for us today, more important than ever. So the Holy Father, well, he begins by saying, when I first said those words, I myself had no idea how far they would go. It was just said in the Spirit. And then he says a little bit later in his answer, have no fear of that which you yourselves have created. Think of biotechnology and weapons and so many things. Have no fear of all that man has produced, and that every day is becoming more dangerous for him. Finally, have no fear of yourselves. It's exactly what we've seen Venerable Bruno say over and over again. It's that fear. Depart from me, Lord, I'm a sinful man. Finally, have no fear of yourselves. And I love sharing that because my own conviction, as I've said, is that this is the deepest fear in all of us. No, don't live with that fear. Have no fear of yourselves. When Jesus, and I love Jesus' answer here, when Peter says, depart from me, Lord, I'm a sinful man, Jesus doesn't argue with Peter. He just says the one thing Peter needs to hear more than anything else, do not be afraid, and confirms his belonging in his mission. And then the Holy Father answers the question squarely, why should we have no fear? because we have been redeemed by God. In the redemption, we find the most profound basis for the words, do not be afraid. By the redemption, we mean the cross and the resurrection of Christ. That's the redemption, the cross and the resurrection of Christ. The more you return to, meditate on, enliven your faith in the redemption, the power of the death and resurrection of Jesus, the more you will find fear dissipating in your life. In the redemption, we find the most profound basis for the words, do not be afraid. It struck me over the 27 years of John Paul's pontificate. I was a deacon when he was made Pope. I actually served Mass for him as deacon on 3 occasions. Just shamelessly stared at him watching him pray. It dawned on me finally that the redemption was at the heart of everything for him. Just look sometime at the title of his documents, the Redeemer of Man, the Mother of the Redeemer, the Gift of Redemption, the Mission of the Redeemer, and on and on and on. The redemption was at the heart of his pontificate. Since I told you that I shamelessly stared at the Pope, I'll add one other thing. The Pope had a practice, he would be deeply recollected in prayer, and then every so often he would suddenly look up with a gaze of just piercing awareness. He just knew that he was alive to everything around him. When he would do that, I'd quickly look down. And then as soon as he would go back to his recollection, I'd look up and continue to look at him again. In the redemption, we find the most profound basis for the words, do not be afraid. Quoting John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. That's the redemption. Now, please take these next words to heart. This Son is always present in the history of humanity as Redeemer. The redemption pervades all of human history. So you read your paper today, or you go online and you read or listen to the news. Just know that the deepest news of every day, the deepest truth of every day is this: the power of the cross and resurrection of Christ, which pervades every day of human history. Can you see where hope is being born here? It is the light that shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And this is the single sentence of John Paul II that I go back to more than anything else he ever said or wrote. The power of Christ's cross and resurrection, that's the redemption. The power of Christ's cross and resurrection is greater than any evil we can or should fear. If you're listening to this, you can say it aloud with me again. The power of Christ's cross and resurrection is greater than any evil we can or should fear. Let's do it once more. The power of Christ's cross and resurrection is greater than any evil we can or should fear. Which says this: there are evils in the world that we can fear. More, there are evils in the world that we should fear. But there is a power in the world greater than any of them, and that is the power of the cross and resurrection of Christ, which pervades all of human history every single day. Which leads him then to the sentence from which the title of the book is taken. It is very important, these are his own italics, to cross the threshold of hope, not to stop before it, but to let oneself be led. Here's my image. Make it a cold winter day if you want. Darkness has fallen if you wish. And here is a person hesitatingly climbs the steps and stands on the threshold of the house. Inside, he or she can hear the voices of people gathered, maybe at supper, the warmth of the light filling the room, the laughter, the small sounds of a dinner shared. Everything in this person wants to move out of the isolation and darkness and loneliness of the threshold and to cross the threshold into the place of warmth and communion. And John Paul says it is very important to cross the threshold of hope, not to stop before it, but to let oneself be led. If we cross that threshold, discouragement will wane, fear will wane, and a sense of hope and courage in serving the Lord will grow in our hearts, and then all the spiritual doors are open. And that's my prayer for us all.